According to documents from the U.S. Department of Defense, November 1, 1955 was the date when the U.S. officially intervened in Vietnam, and during that time, the U.S. Military Support Expert Group in Vietnam was established. According to Vietnam, the war between the two countries had already begun in 1947 when the U.S. began to aid France so that France could continue to fight in Vietnam. However, regardless of the time frame, 1947, 1955, or 1965, at the beginning of the war, the U.S. entered the battlefield with the mindset of a victor. In fact, the American confidence was not without foundation because it came from a country that had just won World War II with a constantly expanding defense industry at home. Therefore, the Americans were more confident that nothing could stop them in the Vietnam battlefield. However, very quickly, they would realize that they were bogged down in a war that was more devastating than World War II and beyond the capacity of the entire American economy. A war in which America would not only lose money, soldiers, weapons, and prestige, but also lose its position as the world's only superpower. However, to better understand this devastation, we need to talk about the numbers of losses that America suffered during its time in Vietnam. Many Americans, including President Richard Nixon, once called the Vietnam War the Third World War, a simple term, but enough to describe the scale of its ferocity and magnitude. Because since 1974, the U.S. war in Vietnam has gone through 5 presidents from Eisenhower, John Kennedy to Lyndon Baines Johnson, Richard Nixon, and Gerald Rudolph Ford. However, no one has been able to help the U.S. win. Meanwhile, up to 77% of the Army, 66% of the Marines and Air Force, 40% of the Navy, 6.5 million soldiers, 22,000 businesses of the U.S. were mobilized to serve the Vietnam War. The U.S. also attracted 5 other countries dependent on the U.S., including Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Thailand, and the Philippines, with the highest number of troops up to 70,000 troops to join the war with 550,000 U.S. expeditionary troops as the core of more than 1 million soldiers of the Republic of Vietnam. However, the Americans still did not have a single victory, and on the contrary, received a huge number of losses. Specifically, on the Vietnam battlefield, 58,120 U.S. soldiers died, 305,000 soldiers were injured, of which 153,303 were severely disabled, 23,114 were completely disabled. In addition to the physical injuries, about 700,000 U.S. soldiers out of a total of 2.7 million U.S. soldiers who fought in Vietnam suffered from mental disorders, commonly known as Vietnam Syndrome. This eventually led to the deaths of between 70,000 and 300,000 American veterans who committed suicide upon returning from Vietnam. This brings the total number of American casualties to 400,000, including those who died in the war and those who committed suicide due to deep trauma. Meanwhile, the U.S. Department of Defense figures show that the number of American soldiers killed in World War II was 405,399. The loss of life is enough to show how the war in Vietnam exhausted the United States. However, that is not all. In terms of finance, the U.S. spent $676 billion USD on the Vietnam War, and if you include indirect costs, the number is up to $920 billion USD. This loss is second only to the U.S.'s cost in World War II, equivalent to about $200 billion USD and higher than the U.S.'s cost in World War I. Not to mention the cost of supporting veterans after this war, the U.S. still had to spend from $200 billion to $1,800 billion USD on the war in Vietnam, which means this number has far exceeded the cost of World War II. The financial deficit that followed left the entire United States in a difficult situation, because during the war, in order to meet the needs and efforts to win, consumer goods factories were converted to produce military equipment, causing a decline in goods, causing high inflation, and deeply hurting the economy. The financial loss caused a budget deficit. pushing the U.S. economy into a gloomy recession in the 1970s. It can be seen that after the Vietnam War, not only people but also the U.S. economy entered a dark period, which led to the U.S. military having to limit its overseas activities for 15 years until the Gulf War occurred. The Vietnam War really exhausted an entire empire. In the United States at that time, many comparisons were made. It was said that if the cost of the Vietnam War was compared to the symbolic programs that the U.S. government had implemented, Vietnam still emerged as the most expensive program in the history of this country. The entire interstate road system of the U.S. in 1972 only cost 53 billion USD, or the U.S. space program to put people on the moon only cost 25 billion USD. This was what made President Richard Nixon admit after the war, "Never in the history of the United States have so many resources been used so inefficiently as in the war in Vietnam." These figures have caused the U.S. government to receive countless criticisms, even though the war has ended. After all, if viewed from a macro perspective, the damage caused by the war in Vietnam is no less than that of World War II. And if viewed from the perspective of a soldier who fought in Vietnam, the Vietnam War is actually much more terrifying than World War II. The fear that haunts the Vietnam War is not actually in the amount of money and lives, but in the psychological warfare. If asked which war is more terrifying and haunting between the Vietnam War and World War II, American veterans will certainly answer that it is the Vietnam War. Because many American soldiers who fought in Vietnam also participated in World War II, and to them, World War II was just like a walk. During the Vietnam War, the average American soldier spent about 240 days in combat a year, compared to about 40 days in World War II, 6 times less than in Vietnam. A soldier's total combat time was measured by the time he spent in front-line combat, or in the danger of being killed in a raid. The rest of the time was spent stationed in non-combat areas, on field trips, or on leave. With the time of fighting since the first American soldiers landed in Da Nang on March 8, 1965, and the last American soldier left Vietnam on March 29, 1973, American soldiers fought in Vietnam for a total of 2,143 days, longer than any war in American history. Even the American Civil War of 1861-1865 only lasted a total of 1,488 days, half the time American soldiers fought in Vietnam. And up to now, no war that America has participated in has surpassed this record in terms of time. If the amount of time is still not enough for you to imagine the cruelty of the Vietnam War for American soldiers, then come with us to the heavy psychology of American soldiers. It will give you a clearer sense of this fear. The marching in World War II was also completely different from the marching on the battlefield in Vietnam. In Vietnam, American soldiers could be attacked immediately when they were marching in areas considered green zones, i.e., safe zones. American soldiers in South Vietnam could be attacked at any time, anywhere. For example, in the Mao Than Battle in 1968, the Vietnamese army launched attacks on the night of the 30th of Tet in the middle of Saigon, leaving the Americans no time to react. This is considered a special feature of Vietnamese tactics that did not exist in World War II. Compared to World War II, the war in Vietnam was clearly longer in duration and more difficult for American soldiers in every way, and the destruction of this war has been deeply ingrained in American society for many years. It has even worn down American politics. Not only the soldiers who directly fought in Vietnam felt fear, but also the American politicians, who were equally ashamed when stepping onto the diplomatic stage. Since the real images of the Vietnam War were captured by the American media and press and made public to the world, the reputation and prestige of a just America were seriously damaged. The waves of criticism not only came from the international community, but also took root and sprouted right inside this country. President Nixon, who witnessed the defeat of the U.S. military in the 12-day-and-night war in which B-52 bombers bombed Hanoi and many other cities in the North, wrote in his memoirs, "In the Vietnam War, not only did the U.S. authorities lose the war, but we also lost on American soil, in the hallways of Congress, in the dining rooms of companies, in the directors' rooms of research organizations, in the editorial rooms of newspapers and television systems, in the halls of Georgetown, in the living rooms of beautiful women in New York, and in the classrooms of major universities. These were the classes that had added strength to ensure America's victory in World War I and World War II, but they were also the ones who caused America to fail in the most important battle of World War III, which was in Vietnam." After World War II, America's prestige had been resounding thanks to the defeat of fascism. But the Vietnam War had destroyed everything. The unity within America had deteriorated, especially the people's trust in the government was decreasing. Many countries in the world turned their backs on America. The nation also turned back to the U.S. government. Washington's prestige was destroyed by the war in Vietnam. The defeat in Vietnam tarnished our ideals, weakened our spirit and will, President Nixon wrote in his memoirs. Maxwell Taylor, the father of special warfare, special advisor to President Johnson, once lamented, "The price we paid for this war was the internal division of America, the exposure of our internal weaknesses to the whole world, and the loss of sovereignty to deal with our urgent domestic and foreign problems. Because of this failure, we had to pay a very heavy price, which was the breakdown of national unity. We all had our part in America's failure in Vietnam, and nothing was good about it." The Vietnam War weakened the United States in almost all important areas from politics, economics, to defense. Therefore, the position of the United States has gradually declined. Although the Vietnam War was a meaningless war for the United States, it was not meaningless to the Vietnamese people because the blood of the Vietnamese people was not shed in vain. Their sacrifices not only brought about changes in the destiny of the nation, but also for the whole world. The multipolar world situation today is also thanks to that sacrifice. If World War II ended with the collapse of Nazi Germany and fascism, thereby ending a dark period of genocide, similarly, the Vietnam War also brought about equally great impacts. Before World War II, Americans never thought of participating in a war in a faraway place across the sea. However, during the Great War, America absolutely did not accept a significant loss due to being isolated from the rest of the world. The U.S. defense industrial base was not damaged at all during the war, even greatly expanded in scale compared to before the war. Many pre-war civilian production facilities even switched to military production due to the huge profits it brought. Therefore, after the end of World War II, American tycoons realized that wars could generate huge profits for them, and they chose Vietnam after achieving a significant victory in Korea. That goal is not only to make money, but also to help the country's defense industry develop rapidly, making the United States the #1 economic and military power. The U.S. aggression opened a dark period for many countries around the world, and there might have been a war between the Soviet Union and the U.S. or China and the U.S. if Washington had not failed in Vietnam. It was the U.S. military being bogged down in Vietnam that from 1972 onwards, the U.S. government shifted from a state of belligerence to a somewhat conciliatory attitude towards China and the Soviet Union. The resumption of cooperation between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, the U.S. and China in 1972, opened a new era, an era of peace for all mankind. However, to achieve this result, it was thanks to the tenacious fighting of the Vietnamese people. Millions of people fell to crush the warlike spirit of the Americans. Vietnam taught the Americans a lesson that military strength is not the only factor for victory, and that the U.S. is not an invincible superpower as they thought. The American modesty was later realized in a speech by U.S. President Barack Obama when he commented on the lesson that the U.S. learned in the Vietnam War. We, Vietnam, and the U.S. are two independent countries, and whether big or small, we all have our own sovereignty, which must be absolutely respected. Big countries cannot bully small countries. Immediately after World War II, the intervention in Vietnam became the largest, longest, fiercest, and most expensive war of the U.S. and the participation of many superpowers in the world. Of course, the impacts it caused were no different from World War III for the Americans, enough to forever change the history of the U.S. and the world.